Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into some truly groundbreaking research from Dharampal's work, Bharat Ka Swadharm. We're going to uncover the actual, hard data-backed truth about pre-colonial Indian education. And honestly, get ready, because what we're about to look at is going to turn pretty much everything we thought we knew about this history completely upside down.
So let's just start right off by challenging a super widely held belief. Growing up, so many of us were taught that early Indian education was this highly exclusionary thing, right? We're told that rigid caste barriers kept the vast majority of regular people totally out of the classroom. We've always been told it was a rare privilege, reserved literally only for the absolute elite. But is that actually true? What does the historical data from the actual ground say?
Well, to answer that, here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the myth of backwardness, the Manure and Adams surveys, castes in the classroom, manufacturing an inferiority complex, and finally, reclaiming India's Swadharm.
All right, Section 1, the myth of backwardness. Let's really examine this narrative that was so meticulously constructed around Indian society.
You see, under British rule, this really powerful myth was just constantly fed to the Indian elite. It was this narrative that pre-colonial India was nothing but a land of backwardness, internal division, and just total intellectual stagnation. The story went that society was steeped in darkness and desperately needed Western education to come in and save it. Section 2, the Monroe and Adams surveys. Let's see exactly what happens to that myth when it runs headfirst into the actual administrative records kept by the British themselves.
The actual historical reality here is anchored by these massive, comprehensive surveys conducted by British officials. The big ones were by Governor Thomas Monroe down in the Madras Presidency starting in 1822, and then William Adam in Bengal and Bihar over in the 1830s. Basically, they were officially tasked with figuring out the state of local indigenous education.
And what they found was absolutely not some barren intellectual wasteland. Not even close. Instead, they meticulously documented this vast, thriving network of local schools all across the subcontinent. William Adam literally noted that there was essentially a school for every single village in Bengal and Bihar. Education wasn't some incredibly rare privilege. It was a functioning daily reality. And crucially for us today, these officials kept very detailed demographic records of exactly who the students and teachers were.
Which brings us to Section 3, castes in the classroom. So who is actually sitting in these learning spaces?
If we look at the raw data from the Madras Presidency detailing the caste-wise breakdown of students across different districts, it completely shatters this century-old assumption. The newly educated elite had been completely convinced that traditional Indian education was strictly limited to the twice-born upper castes, specifically Brahmins. But this documented reality on the ground, it tells a completely different story.
When you actually map this data out, the takeaway is undeniably clear. Shudras and other non-Brahmin, so-called lower castes, didn't just attend these schools, they actually formed the overwhelming majority of students in the indigenous education system. The data is literally right there, staring at us.
To put a precise number on it, these surveys reveal that in several Tamil-speaking districts, a staggering 70 to 84% of the students belong to Shudra and other marginalized castes. In places like South Arcot, it was over 84%. So that whole narrative of these exclusive Brahmin-only classrooms, it's basically a statistical fiction when you compare it to the actual historical ground realities.
And get this, it wasn't just true for the students. William Adams' Bengal survey reveals that the teachers themselves came from an incredibly diverse range of backgrounds. We almost always picture the traditional Indian teacher as this exclusive Brahmin scholar, right? But the reality recorded in these districts paints a vibrant, wildly inclusive picture. Teaching was absolutely not a monopolized profession. In the Bengal districts they surveyed, you had Kayathas, Sadgaps, Agriyas, and Brahmins all actively instructing the next generation together. There were even teachers from castes that some considered untouchable. The entire social fabric was actively involved in passing down knowledge.
Moving on to Section 4, manufacturing an inferiority complex. Okay, so this brings up a massive, glaring historical paradox. If the reality was actually this inclusive and expansive, how on earth did modern Indians completely forget it?
Well, Dharampal's research points to a deeply engineered psychological shift. He explains how colonial education and administrative policies purposefully and systematically disconnected the Indian elite from their own roots. It wasn't just, a simple change in the school syllabus. It was a deliberate erasure of historical memory designed specifically to establish British civilizational superiority.
This engineered erasure gave rise to a phenomenon known as Atmaglani,
Basically, it's a pervasive, entirely manufactured sense of intense self-reproach, guilt, and civilizational inferiority. The newly Western-educated Indian elite, who Dharampal refers to as the Nava Buddha, started to view their own indigenous history, society, and traditions with total contempt. They fully internalized the colonizers' view of themselves.
And by replacing hard historical facts with colonial propaganda, the ruling class achieved this massive psychological victory. Real indigenous achievements in education, science, and industry were just totally wiped from memory. Western frameworks became the one and only universal standard for what meant progress, and ultimately, these elite Indians unknowingly became native mouthpieces, perpetuating the exact same colonial narratives that subjugated their own history in the first place.
Which brings us to our final section, reclaiming India's Swadharm. But look, Dharampal doesn't just drop this bleak reality on us and leave. He actually points us toward a really profound and actionable solution.
He argues that if India wants to truly break free from this lingering mental colonization, it has to return to a concept he calls Swadharm. He really stresses the point that no society can ever function optimally if it's constantly evaluating itself through borrowed European lenses. It just doesn't work.
So what does Swadharm actually mean here? It's not just a religious term. In this context, it's a massive civilizational call to action. It means deeply decolonizing the mind and actively rebuilding socio-economic and political frameworks using the society's own innate logic, its own traditions, and its own historical blueprints, rather than forcibly trying to cram itself into imported Western models. And to actually achieve this civilizational reset, Dharampal gives us a clear path. First up, we've got to boldly acknowledge the manufactured historical myths we've all absorbed. Second, we have to do exactly what we did today. Go back and re-examine the hard indigenous data, like those Monroe and Adams surveys. And third, we must recenter Indian conceptual frameworks as the primary driver for societal progress, rather than always treating European philosophy as the universal default setting.
I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder today. We've just seen how an incredibly diverse, inclusive, and sprawling education system was totally erased and replaced with a literal myth of darkness and exclusion. So, if a reality that massive could be so effectively wiped from our collective memory, what else have we been engineered to forget? Because I promise you, once you start pulling on the thread of history, you might just unravel everything you thought you knew. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the narrative.